When it comes to certain movies, films, cinematic experiences, whatever you want to refer to them as, within certain genres of film, and it doesn't even necessarily need to be horror, there are movies which people put on pedestals, movies which set the standard for that respective genre. And this is kind of one of those, in the, some would say, torture porn or gorno kind of genre. Martyrs, a French film. I own both this original and the remake. I have not watched the remake yet, and I do plan to, hopefully, at least do a review for that one as well. I am not opposed to the idea of remakes. One of my favourite movies is Oldboy, the Korean version, but I also like the American remake, because it does some things differently. Likewise with other films, I have liked remakes. In the case of this one, we'll see if that's the case, but for now, I'm reviewing the original. Now, this is a French film, of course, subtitles ahoy, but who really has an issue with that if you like good cinema? And just like some of the other foreign, aka non-English films, which I've discussed before, I love this film. It is certainly intense, it's certainly brutal, but it does it very well. Now, there are certain things in particular which stood out for me, and I'm not going to spoil anything, as usual, but there are certain things which stood out in terms of things which I think everyone who likes these kind of movies will love, and certain things which people might have an issue with, again, without spoiling anything. Now, my personal favourite aspects of the filmmaking involved with this film are, for one thing, the movie is brutal. Now, you probably expect that to be the case, but there are a certain selection of words that you can use when you talk about certain horror films. Disgusting, gory, bloody, brutal, intense, scary, terrifying. These are all commonly used terms. But when you actually break it down and think of what term should apply to a certain film, it's easy to just throw those terms out there for the sake of having nice words. But there are certain movies which genuinely demand to be categorized in that way. And if I could select two words to describe this one, Martyrs, it would be intense and brutal. Those two things together, I feel, sum up the entire theme, the storytelling, the visuals, the entire concept of this film in those two words, intense and brutal. It's not a movie which is ridiculously gory or even ridiculously bloody in an over-the-top kind of way. There is gore, for sure, there is blood, for sure, but it's on a different level to something like The Thing, or The Blob, or a number of other monster movies which we've discussed. At the same time, though, this movie is often lumped in with films like The Human Centipede or Hostel. It does not deserve to be. This is a class above. In fact, it's not a class above, it's a league above those films. Now, you're probably thinking I'm going to give this a ridiculously high score, but not necessarily, because in certain ways the movie is not bad, but it's just not outstanding. Now, one of those particular ways for me is the story itself, and this brings me to some of the issues which I think some people could have with this movie. Now, without spoiling anything, the ending in particular, where things come into play, as you'd expect, realities are brought to light, etc., etc. When that happens, I do feel that if you are of a certain upbringing and a certain background, the movie's theme, the revealed themes, the tone, and in particular the ending, will have a different result and a different feeling for you than for someone who's had a certain different upbringing. And I can't really get more specific than that without spoiling it. So we'll leave it at that. If you've already seen the film, and I know some of you guys like to watch these reviews even though you have already seen them, then you probably know what I'm referring to, with the ending in particular. But in some ways, the movie goes above the genre, and the ways in which it does do that are, I think, why it's so good, because a movie like this could very easily just go in for being as shocking as possible, having gratuitous nudity, gratuitous blood, gratuitous mean-spirited violence, and although some of those factors are in there, there is, as far as I can remember, no nudity, so that'll disappoint some people. Personally, I like that, it's refreshingly different. There is a surprising limit to the blood, but a lot more gore than there is blood, which I personally love because gore is far more visually appealing and entertaining than blood is. Because as far as I'm concerned, once you get to 8 or 9 gallons of blood, it kind of stops meaning anything. You've seen so much of it, you might as well paint the screen red. Blood has never done it for me, gore does, and this movie has that. And in one specific way, I would actually liken Martyrs much more to a movie called Green Room than I would to something like Hostel or The Human Centipede, because those movies are gratuitous. In particular, Hostel and the second and third Centipede films, they are gratuitous for the sake of it. That's the point. This movie is not. Every single thing that happens, every act of violence, every act of brutality on any of the roles or on behalf of any of the people in the film is there for a purpose. Everything has a meaning. It all adds into the overall story. And to really sum up my thoughts of how good I believe this movie was, I watched this movie twice, back to back. That doesn't happen that often for me. Some of the movies where that has happened are such as Oldboy. And Oldboy, I believe, is one of the most perfect films ever made. So that gives you some idea of how highly I think of this movie. I also watched Black Mountainside back to back, which is a controversial horror film, but I absolutely adore it. It immediately became my second favourite horror movie of all time, and I have to say, although I haven't specifically thought about where it is, for instance in my top 5 or top 10, I do believe this is one of my favourite horror films. Because although it delivers pretty much everything you'd want from a great horror film, it does it in a way which manages to come off as being simultaneously very clever and very high thinking, but, and this is the great thing, without being pretentious. I cannot stand movies that are pretentious. This movie is not, but it is clever. And I would say that Oldboy, again, has that in common. Oldboy is a very artsy film, but it's not pretentious. And that is a very fine line to walk, and I believe that Martyrs does it extremely well. Now, as far as the individual scores, mini spoiler alert, I'm not actually going to score it quite as high as you might expect, so we'll get into why. First of all, then, we have the story and the plot, and this is one of the scores that you might think would be higher, but actually no, I'm going to give it a 7. Now, the reason why I'm giving it a 7, which is certainly well above par, is because the concept itself is not overly complex. It could seem it when you first watch it, but if you actually break it down, it's not. It's more so the way it's told, but the way it's told is one of the reasons why it's way above par. It's well told, it has an emotional punch, and something which I actually totally forgot about was that this is one of the very few films which on both occasions that I watched it, back to back, it made me tear up. Both times, at the same point in the film, almost to the second. That impresses me, because although for the most part I am an emotionless person, certain films, at what some people would consider to be weird occasions, can elicit an emotional response with me. And it's not like full-on sobbing, but welling up is something that I like doing. But the film has to earn that. And this movie does. And as I said, it's probably not a scene where many people would well up. It would be more a scene where people would be shocked and kind of mouth agape. But for me, it has a different response. And again, it's because of movies like The Andromeda Strain, where it gets more intense the more you actually think about it. It's not just what's blatantly shown on screen. So the story is well told, but at the same time, I don't believe that it deserves to be insanely high. So that's why I'm giving it a 7. As far as the characters, the motivations, the casting, well, for that I am going to give it a 9, because they're superb. The two primary girl characters, they're both great, they're both very different, but they're both great. The way they play off each other, the way their stories intertwine is very good, but also the secondary characters, of which there are quite a few, are also excellent. Now, of course, I haven't got into stuff like the essential story, because this is one of those movies that you really can't get into the story of too much without starting to spoil stuff, but keeping it at the bare minimum, something which you could pretty easily find on Google, and I would not recommend searching much about this film if you haven't seen it, because you don't want to spoil yourself. But the essential concept is it's about a girl who escapes from some form of torture. She's sent to an orphanage, and then she makes a friend. Then we skip forward 15 years, and we follow the friends again. But now she's trying to find who did it to her and why. And we go from there. The majority of the film takes place in one home. And again, that, to any who know me and my taste in films, directly plays into and feeds my love. I love movies with not many characters that take place in just a couple of locations, or even one location, if possible. This movie isn't quite one location, but it's pretty close to it. So again, that's great. And the characters across the board are fantastic. The main characters, the side characters, and there are quite a few side characters as well, and they're all fantastic. The performances are believable, they are brutal when they need to be, they are emotionally susceptible to pain when they need to be. They're fantastic across the board, and actually in particular, one of the lead girls, I would say, is Oscar-worthy. She is that good. So yeah, pretty great, and that's why I'm giving it a 9. Next up then, we have the visuals and the effects, and for the visuals and effects, I'm going to go even higher with a 10. And the reason why I'm giving it a full 10 is because, in a similar way to a movie which I mentioned earlier, Green Room, this movie has a specific type of violence which I really cling to in films, and that is realistic, brutal violence. Violence which doesn't try to be over the top, it tries to present murder, torture, and death in as believable and as disturbing a way as possible. Because the secret to being truly disturbing is not to overplay the scenario. The secret to being truly disturbing, and you can see this from watching actual serial killer footage, which I have done in the past, the truly disturbing imagery, such as those real killings, does not come from overhyping the killing. It comes from the lack of hype, making it feel almost normal. That is where true fear comes from. That is where truly unsettling imagery comes from. And this movie goes more towards that end of the spectrum, and that is why it's so good. The effects, and in particular the makeup, more than anything else, because there are actually relatively few practical and even less CGI effects. It's mostly makeup, and the makeup is incredible. And tying into my point earlier about tearing up, one of the main reasons for that was due to a certain character's makeup. It's incredible. The visuals of the film, they have this strange emotional resonance across the board. Mostly anger, sometimes frustration, sometimes empathy. It really does span across the spectrum for me, but at the same time I do feel that this is the kind of movie that other people will go and watch it and think, what is he talking about? I'm not feeling these emotions at all, because it's that kind of film. As I said earlier, like the Andromeda Strain, in order to appreciate just how good this movie is, and how good the acting is and the tones, you do definitely need to think about it, because the movie doesn't spoon feed you. And that's great. That's exactly how it should be. So as far as the audio, the soundtrack, the music, well, for that I'm going to give it a 6, which of course isn't quite as high. That's down there more with the story, a little bit lower than the story, the lowest score of them all actually. But the reason why I'm giving it a 6 is because this isn't really the kind of movie where amazing sound design is all that important. The sound in this movie is not so much a character as a means to an end. It's predominantly more a visual movie. The music is there, the effects are good, the audio effects that is, and the ambience is all great. But at the same time, it's not the forefront. There are certain movies where the sound design is at the forefront, something like The Thing, or The Babadook, or Black Mountainside. They strongly rely on the audio. The Babadook in particular has brilliant sound design. This movie, the polar opposite. You could watch this movie on mute, and you would still get a lot out of it. So the sound design is more than good enough, the score is more than good enough, which is why I gave it a more than good enough score of an above par 6. At the same time though, it's probably, comparatively speaking, the weakest point of the film. And that doesn't do it justice, because that makes it sound bad, but it's just not as incredible as the rest. And finally, for the most subjective, of course, the rewatchability and entertainment, well, initially I was going to give this film a 7. However, upon further reflection, because I scored this film within the couple of days after watching it. Now though, being about a week out, I'm going to give it a 10. And the reason why I'm going to give it a full 10, which may seem like an unrealistically drastic change, is because of the effect that this film has had on me since then, and also how it's gotten better over time. Even in the space of a week, it immediately got better. As I said, I watched it back to back straight away anyway, so that immediately goes to show that it has a ton of rewatchability. At the same time, of course, that was on my own, not with a group. This is the kind of movie which could be watched with a group of people, but I believe you'd have to watch it with a very specific group of friends. People who want to watch something which is a very intense experience, which may even leave one or two of you feeling a little bit uncomfortable at certain scenes. Not to a ridiculous degree, but potentially, depending on the people there. So it does definitely have some group watchability and rewatchability, but at the same time it's not really a popcorn film. It's more like a movie lovers film for a group of like-minded people who want to appreciate some incredible, brutal cinema. On your own, it definitely has rewatchability, so when I combine those two together, plus the fact that just like Split, one of my favourite movies, in fact my favourite movie of 2017, that movie got better and better over time. This movie is already doing the same. It's climbing up my favourites list. As I said earlier, I haven't actually ranked it, but I have a feeling it might be quite high. So it's got to be a 10. And overall, that means that I'm giving Martyrs a very impressive score of 4.2 out of 5, which, if memory serves, is actually on par with my favourite movie of all time, John Carpenter's The Thing. That is one of the higher scores on this channel, not quite ultimate level, around a 4.5 or a 4.6, but still very, very high. That's up there for me with movies like The Thing, Alien, Predator, which might be a bit more controversial, but that kind of caliber. Totally different kind of horror, but so good at what it does. So, if you haven't checked out this movie, definitely do so. This, I would say, is, well, in kind of a way, the Oldboy of horror movies. It's not like Oldboy, but at the same time it's kind of like Oldboy, more so in the filmmaking and how good it is, rather than any specific story point. And I'm sure there are people who would disagree with that, but I think there are people who would probably understand what I mean by that as well. So definitely check out this movie. As I said, I have not watched the remake yet, but when I do get around to doing so, I will score it, I will see how I feel about it, and potentially even do a review. So here's hoping that that will be good. I don't expect it to be as good, but we'll see. And for now, as always, thanks for watching.